I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch, joined as always by Dr. Patrick Wyman, my intrepid co-host. And as you can tell, I am a little sick. I hear there's ragweed in the air, so maybe that's it. I don't really know. I seem to have some kind of late summer cold. So I'm doing, Pat, what the doctor always recommends when you're sick, which is drinking bourbon. But don't worry, because it's on the rocks, so it's good for me.
Yeah, I was going to say drinking bourbon while using your voice and talking a lot. And I was also going to say ragweed sounds like a hell of a lot less fun than regular weed. So I'm sorry for that, Connor. That seems unpleasant.
If I had that, I might counter the ragweed with that instead of bourbon. But unfortunately, all I've got is this Evan Williams here, so I'm sticking with the whiskey for today.
Well, there we go.
Yes, it's working okay so far. So today, Pat, and I know this is going to be upsetting to people. This reminds me of I think I may have mentioned this on the show before last time I was sick. But when I was a kid, I used to watch the Flintstones, and I was very upset as a child when they changed voice actors for Barney. And I think this might be the same experience for any of our young listeners. They hear like a sick man. It ruins everything, especially when it's so focused on the voices. Yeah. So I do apologize.
Yeah, we apologize to those of our listeners who tuned in solely for Connor's dulcet tones. They will return next week.
Are you implying that they tune in for other reasons?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and imply that. Actually, I'm not going to imply that. I'm going to go ahead and straight up say it, Connor.
You will say it overtly. Sometimes they tune in for your voice, too. So, Pat, today we've got a couple things to talk about. Further on in the show, we're going to be discussing Arlovski Barnett. That is next week's UFC card in Hamburg, Germany. It's got a couple of interesting prospect debuts. The main event is a fairly meaningful heavyweight affair. But first... and then at the end of the show, by the way, we're going to be doing some heavy bag questions. But first, before we cover any of that, we want to talk about last week's show. Demian Maia, Carlos Condit. Carlos Condit, the perennial contender, despite being 2-4 in his last 6 fights, is always fighting top opponents, always putting on credible performances. Rarely do you come away saying, oh, Carlos Condit was dominated. No way did he have any chance of winning that fight. Demian Maia submitted him in about 2 minutes. It was about as close to a perfect fight as you can possibly have in the UFC. Demian Maia threw 5 strikes, landed all 5, shot for 1 takedown, and finished it, and went for 1 submission and finished it. He basically accomplished everything. Oh, and he succeeded in both of his pass attempts as well. He basically accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish with ease. So let us dedicate the first part of the show basically just to celebrating the game of Demian Maia. And this will give us a bit of a chance to talk about grappling and the integration of a grappling game into striking as well, something we don't get to talk about very much. So opening thoughts on this fight, Pat.
So that was beautiful, gorgeous work from Demian Maia, who remains one of the very nicest guys in MMA. Mm-hmm. I'm coming to enjoy more than anything his very polite post-fight call-outs.
Yeah.
Like, I think it would be nice if I got a title shot. I think I've earned it. Also, and always finding time to cut a little infomercial for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in that little in that space. I respect that a lot. Yeah. Finding time. I don't know if you're a listener of the Co-Main Event podcast with Ben Folks and Chad Dundas, but they have a recurring bit about Demian Maia's Jiu-Jitsu instructional videotapes, and every time he finds room for those.
I mean, how could you who would you rather learn Jiu-Jitsu from though? I mean, Demian Maia, I don't really think I can come up with anybody who's more consistently successful, especially Demian Maia at welterweight. He is probably the most successful jiu-jitsu practitioner in MMA history, perhaps.
I'd say he's up there. I'd say it's in terms of accomplishments in jiu-jitsu, in terms of like raw accomplishments as a grappler and accomplishments in MMA. The list is basically him,
Jacare,
and Verdum, right?
Yeah. And then
That's the
in
conversation.
MMA, I don't really know if anyone, like right now, is having more success using a primarily grappling game to beat their opponents than Demian Maia.
Yeah, absolutely not. But so I think this is really interesting because a lot of the conversation about Maia's resurgence and success has focused on the fact that he is no longer looking to engage in shitty kickboxing matches. That
Yeah.
everything he does now is focused around getting him to in on a shot, finishing that shot, or at least creating a scramble, and then either finding his way to the back or getting on top. And I think that misses some very important things about Maya's resurgence. And first of all, that's that okay, he's not looking to strike on the feet anymore, but his pressure footwork has gotten better and better and
Yes.
better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Notice how much of that newfound wrestling success is coming against the fence. Guys aren't getting to the fence because they want to get to the fence. Guys are getting to the fence because Maya's pressure footwork is forcing them there. It's really excellent work.
Yeah, I don't really have any doubt that this Demian Maia would beat the Anderson Silva, even the one that he fought way back in the day. I think he would succeed in taking Anderson down and out-grappling him on the ground.
I don't know if I would go that far, but I think that he would certainly have he would have given it a good go.
Because he really, I mean, that was the fight that I think Maia has spoken in interviews about how that fight opened his eyes to the weaknesses of his wrestling. He realized that if he wanted to be a jiu-jitsu practitioner in MMA, he needed to be able to take the fight to the ground. And then that also sparked a sort of new interest in his striking. He needed to be able to stalk his opponent and set up those takedowns. And the big problem he had against Anderson is that he was rarely even close enough to set up a shot. I mean, when distance was being closed, it was almost always Anderson, and Maia was closing distance more later in the fight when Anderson had started to tire and Maia had himself had grown a little desperate. But he was really chasing after him and sort of flailing. He was not making small steps into the pocket the way that he does now. I think the biggest thing that stands out to me about Demian Maia on the feet is that if you watch his past 5, 6, 7 fights since his welterweight debut, he's so much closer to his opponent than he ever was before all the time. And that has given fighters trouble. I mean, Demian had success striking with Rory McDonald, not because he is a better technical striker, not because his hands are cleaner, because they're not, but because Rory is used to using footwork to get away, and when Demian started swinging at Rory, he made sure that he shuffled in close enough that he could land. And that also set up his takedowns. Every time that Rory committed to a strike trying to scare Maia off, Maia was more than close enough to shoot in, which is great because it's an old man's style of fighting, right? It's a 38-year-old style of wrestling. Maia's shot is not very good. He's not explosive. He's not all that strong or quick. But he's close enough that he doesn't have to drive you off your feet as long as he can get fully in on your leg, and then he can work his chain wrestling.
The footwork is reminiscent of a more technical version of what Dan Henderson was doing when he was having a lot of success a few years ago.
Yeah.
In the sense that it's not terribly explosive in terms of its forward movement, though Maia has always had a fairly explosive step when he really drives for it, same as Henderson. But what Maia does well is short, choppy little steps. Really short, precise, specific steps that take him exactly where he wants to go. He's like the rich man's version of Dan Henderson's footwork from 2010 and 2011.
Rich man's. You know what makes him a rich man too? Is feinting. Demian Maia is an active pressure fighter. He's not. The problem with Dan Henderson has always been that, and this is both a strength and a weakness of Dan's, but it's that you know exactly what he's looking for. Every single time. He's looking for the right hand. Now, that makes him a threatening fighter. If you're inexperienced or if you are nervous about it, you see his right hand, and in the words of my man Luis Monda, he holds it on his shoulder like a bazooka, ready to fire. You know he's going to hit you with that right hand if you get too close, and so the threat works. It makes it difficult to just have your way with Dan Henderson, but it also makes it so that if you are cautious, you have an easier time of avoiding that right hand, especially because it really is all that he wants to land. Much like Demian Maia, really what he wants to do is get in on your hips and take you down. So how do you disguise that? You can't just come in and inch your way forward, look for the other person to overcommit, basically let them seal their own fate and shoot. You have to disguise your intentions. You have to make them react. And Maia does that by feinting his way forward. He keeps a very active upper body to go with his small steps, and he's very convincing with his feints. Even though Maia doesn't actually commit to striking his opponent all that often, he is convincing with his feints. And that is something that a lot of fighters lack, especially a lot of grapplers who just kind of throw trash with their hands in the attempt to draw your eyes. We have seen this many times. Maybe you can help me come up with some examples, Pat. But we've seen many times fighters who just kind of throw stuff in your face and then dive on your legs. And it never gets the desired reaction because their arm punches, yes, there are hands actually coming at your face, but you just don't buy it. You're not really that worried about it. And Maia's very convincing. He drops his weight, he sets his feet, a little jerk of the shoulder, he tenses. It's not enough to tire him out, but it is enough to sell the notion that he's about to strike. It either gets you to parry or to step back and cut yourself off, or it gets you to try and counter and expose your hips to a takedown.
Well, it's credible because, as you pointed out very perceptively, Connor, Maia is in range.
Right.
It doesn't do you any good to feint if your opponent knows that you're 2 feet too far away to hit him with anything, which is what I think we see a lot of from grapplers turned MMA fighters. Is their understanding of spacing, distance, and where you are in the cage is so basic that they can't sell a feint. Even if the feint itself looks convincing, the context in which the feint takes place robs it of any actual value for you. And so Maia, it's not just that Maia's feints are convincing, it's also that he has put himself in positions, his opponent's back close to the fence, not too much room to step away, the threat of the level change in the takedown, the range, that all of those things are credible at once to sell the feint. So it's a really excellent game. It's a really efficient game. It's the kind of game that you wish more older fighters would take up as time goes on, because I tweeted this out after the fight, but Maia is a case study in longevity. And there are a few components to that. First and foremost, he barely gets hit. And fighters who barely get hit in fights tend to barely get hit in sparring too, which is where the damage really happens. He's smart with his training. He doesn't do, I think, a lot of really kind of damaging work. I think he does a lot of kind of low pressure, low intensity rolling, wrestling, a lot of drilling, the kind of thing that does not wear your body down as a now 38-year-old. But more than anything, it's that he has continued to grow technically. Like a lot of fighters, as they get older, kind of get set in their ways. They don't want to learn to do new things, or they're so constantly injured that they don't have enough time in the gym to do anything other than spar and get ready for a specific opponent. Maia has continued to get better in every way as he's aged.
Yeah, especially I think the biggest improvement in Maia's game is his dedication to wrestling. That's the key to his game, and he has said that himself. I think he said it in the post-fight interview after this fight. He said wrestling is really the linchpin to his game because he's a grappler. He needs to be able to take people down. So that's his main evolution. And there are a lot of other little things we've already touched on that enhance that. But I think the key to Maia's longevity and his success with his newfound appreciation for wrestling is that he seems to be training wrestling like a jiu-jitsu practitioner. It's not the crazy grind, because there's no way it can be. I would be shocked to discover that Demian Maia is in there doing the wrestling version of brawling with his training partners day in and day out. He's 38 years old. His gas tank bears witness to the fact that he is not the athlete he used to be, and he never was an amazing athlete in terms of power and explosiveness in the first place. It seems that he's a very thoughtful fighter, and I think that is what makes him so successful. You talked about his avoidance of shots recently. I might as well share this statistic. It was discussed on the UFC post-fight show, but Maia has absorbed 13 strikes total in his last 4 fights, which is insane. Jiu-jitsu is better than defensive boxing is basically the point, because Maia is so dominant on the ground and so constantly pursuing what he wants to do. His opponents almost never have a chance to hit him. The guy who hit him the most was Matt Brown, and that was in basically a desperate third round in which Matt Brown was submitted. And Carlos Condit managed to hit him once. Neil Magny didn't land a single strike. And yet, in all of those fights, it's basically Demian Maia throwing under 20 strikes. The most he threw was against Gunnar Nelson, when he basically just slapped him in the face 2 or 3 dozen times from back mount, basically just keeping him busy. So Demian Maia's game it's a marvel, really, of experience and craft. Let's talk a little bit, Pat, about his actual grappling game, because we kind of discussed how it would match up against Carlos Condit's specific kind of grappling, and I think the very systematic way that he approaches his transitions from takedowns to the ground game made him extremely successful against Condit, and he basically from the get-go took away everything that makes Condit a good guard player and a dangerous grappler. Brian Stan mentioned during the fight that Greg Jackson and Carlos had told him that were he to be taken down, their main goal was then to hold Maia in closed guard, not waste energy trying to get up and work him over with elbows, and basically just do what we kind of said he might do, make him work, and make him so that he would tire as the fight went on, rather than opening himself up by trying to grapple with him. He didn't even have a chance to get closed guard. Not even for a second.
This is what makes Demian Maia really interesting in the context of MMA grappling in 2016 to me. It's not just his wrestling acumen, which is substantial and sets him apart from other pure grapplers who have the level of skill that he does or something like it on the ground. It's that he plays such a different game than most people play in MMA in 2016.
Yeah.
That the game right now is all about transitions. And I think we saw that a lot in the Oliveira versus Pettis fight. Like, we saw what a scrambly fight that was, with so many back and forth and back takes, and basically cutting to the line to get to dominant position. We saw that a ton in that fight, and that is the essence of how grappling right now differs from grappling, pure grappling. Like, there are many fewer like long extended sequences of takedown, pass, dominant position, submit. That is not the sequence that we see right now. It's either transition, submission, or transition, back take, submission.
Yeah.
And so, and what I think why Maia has had so much success is there are just way, way, way fewer guys who have the level of skill necessary to deal with that kind of systematic game, or who know how to, or who are even all that good at recovering guard. Like, how many guys are much more likely to train, okay, how do I get an overhook or an underhook and work a get up, as opposed to retaining closed guard.
Yeah.
Like, those are just not skills that are being taught in the same way anymore. So Maia, by never having transitioned to that particular place in modern MMA grappling, has an advantage over these guys. It's very strange, but really interesting.
Yeah, Maia is himself a very good transitional fighter. I mean, we saw that when Condit felt himself losing mount and was forced to kind of have a final gasp, a desperation roll in which he gave up his back, Maia was absolutely ready to take his back. He didn't lose the position. As Condit was forced to go back to his knees, he was ready with the choke. He was already had his arm in position. Maia is a great transitional fighter for the same reason that many others are. He's usually one or two or three or a dozen steps ahead of the guy that he is fighting, but he is also an anti-transitional fighter. He is one of the most effective fighters in MMA, if not the most effective, at taking away opportunities to transition. You only get to create a scramble or a transition on the ground if Maia wants you to, because everything about his top game is based on killing your options, based on taking away what modern MMA fighters want to do to create space and get back to their feet.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of Maia's game, is that he is so good in those transitions too. But those transitions, notice, he allows them to take place mostly against the fence. Yeah. Right. So you're going to try and scramble back to your feet, but that means you are automatically creating an opening for him to get a hook in as you try to get up and turn.
Yeah.
Right. So if he is allowing you to get to that position, then it's going to be one where he automatically has, as you pointed out, a step to get to a dominant position as a result of it. So he steps ahead in everything that he's doing. He can shut down the transitions. He can operate in those transitions, but he's the one who's dictating the context in which those transitions take place.
Yeah. So let's I'm going to give one like specific from this fight just to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. I noticed that Maia's wrestling, I have mentioned this on many platforms, how underrated it is and how effective it is, but never really gotten into the specifics of why. But much like that, the judo of Ronda Rousey, Maia has 2 or 3 options prepared for every adjustment you might make to his takedown. So that is where the transitional genius comes in. So when this fight starts, first of all, he's in range. He's pawing, he's feinting. He's got Carlos Condit worrying about what he's going to do. Condit is trying to be unpredictable. He's moving. He's switching stances, but he's nearing the fence. And so Maia is kind of closing down the distance Condit switches to orthodox, and the moment that leg comes forward, Maia's in on it. Now, as he turns into Condit, the traditional finish for a single leg is to go for a double, and Condit knows this, and so he starts reaching over Maia's back and looking for the switch. Basically, he realizes that he's going to lose this takedown, and the switch is something that Condit uses a lot. When you get a position, you get your far arm inside the sort of crotch or under the thigh of your opponent, you can use that basically to win the scramble. You get some leverage, and you can sort of sneak out the side, take the back, get top position, or return to your feet. And Condit does this a lot. I've said many times how he's a very good wrestler once he's taken down. He's got good counter wrestling abilities from his back or from a seated position. But the thing with Maia is that as soon as you start adapting, he's going to switch direction. He goes to a sort of a low single or a crackdown finish for the single leg, and then the moment Condit hits the floor, he can neither get full guard nor can he hit his switch. Because, and if you want to learn more about this, you should watch BJJ Scout's breakdowns of Demian Maia, because they're pretty amazing and enlightening. But Maia's whole thing on the ground is his sort of tripod positioning. He keeps his head low, his feet low. He's ready to post with either hand to adjust his base, and his hips are high. And so you can't really, unless you really extend yourself and get lucky, you can't close the guard around him. You can't reach up and grab inside his thigh because you have no leverage by the time your hand reaches his crotch. And you can't really use a butterfly because his hips are too high for you to have any strength in that position. And so Demian Maia uses this position so that, A, he doesn't land in closed guard, which is why Condit wasn't able to get it. And then, B, you can't sweep him as he just sort of casually walks around your guard. He's landing in position. He's denying you the transitions you want. All the while, he is just only allowing you the opportunities to escape that he wants you to take. And so if you ever feel like you have a chance to survive against Demian Maia, it's usually your last thought before you go unconscious, because the moment you see a glimmer of hope, it's always a lure. It's always something that Maia wants you to see. He's never in a weak position from top position. It's just, I'm just blown away by how successful he is using such a sort of, I don't want to say it's basic or that it's one-dimensional, his game, but he is the most successful fighter whose game is mostly grappling that I can think of ever, who really, other than Royce Gracie, who was fighting fighters who were don't even compare to the kinds of people that Demian Maia is just easily submitting and dominating on the floor today. He's just a marvel, man.
Yeah, it's stunning. And like, it's the kind of game too that even if he were to suffer some sort of age-related drop-off at this point, I think he could still be a productive kind of like top 8 to top 12-ish fighter for like another 3 years after this. Like,
because there's still a lot of guys that he would just submit in the first 3 minutes.
Yeah, like no matter how much better Neil Magny gets, and assuming Neil Magny is like our baseline for like the 12th or 14th best welterweight in the world, they're like Demian Maia is always going to beat that dude.
Yeah.
Somebody who has kind of questionable takedown defense and isn't as skilled as him on the ground, like that is always going to be. You can't cover up any flaws in those two areas against somebody like Maia. It is not possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree. You wanted to talk a little bit about Paige Van Zandt, Pat?
I did want to talk a little bit about Paige Van Zandt, mostly because the finish was awesome. And if you didn't think that finish was awesome, you have like a comically large axe to grind against her, which, as it turns out, a lot of people do. Like the comments on the feature article that I wrote about her were just horrifying.
Yeah, I didn't check your comments, but I saw your remarks about them.
The worst ones have been deleted, but I'm genuinely disappointed that there are people out there who think it's okay to say things.
As someone who does not like Paige Van Zandt, I shudder to think what other people on the internet just can't dislike something without going whole hog, like
it was a lot of garden variety misogyny mixed in there with like jealousy that they think she's getting opportunities that she doesn't deserve, and like it was just like some really horrific things. But it takes a lot for me to look at an internet comment section now and be like, oh, that's awful.
Be shocked.
And
yeah,
it was that bad. So but so okay, as cool as the finish was, I still want to point out she managed to lose the first round with, I think, a pretty questionable strategy in mind, a pretty questionable game plan. And, like the finish was great, and she deserves credit for winning the fight. That doesn't take anything away from her, but I think it's indicative of the kind of quality of game planning and coaching she's going to be getting moving forward. Like she's an exceptional athlete, and she's dynamic enough to generate finishes like that. But it was not hard for a coach of Eric Del Fiero's caliber to come up with a game plan to stifle that kind of
So
thing.
what do you think was what were the holes that you saw in her execution of game plan in round one?
Her sense of range was terrible.
Yeah.
Just awful. Like she threw that kick a whole bunch of times, and most of the time it came up well short, and she basically got lucky to land it. Like I know that we're not using that, but that was a low probability strike, and she did not do a whole lot to increase her probability of landing it.
Yeah.
The one that finished the fight. So she wasn't. If her goal was to wear Rawlings down, she wasn't really doing much to do that. She had some success in brief moments when she got into the clinch, but she couldn't really hold Rawlings there. Like that's not to say that she wouldn't have won the second and the third rounds as the fight had gone on, but she more or less gave away the first round without getting a whole lot for it in return.
I'm going to disagree slightly. I think neither of us would say that Van Zandt won, or at least definitively won that first round. It was fairly close, but I think most of us had Rawlings winning it. I think it was a bit of a gambit. If I'm giving Van Zandt and her team full credit here, then I think you basically go into a fight with Rawlings expecting with that game plan that you are going to lose the first round, and knowing that it's going to set you up for two better rounds. A lot of what she was throwing, I agree with you on the sense of range. Van Zandt is not much of a striker. We saw that in her fight with Rose Namajunas. It was really no better this time, despite fighting a much less effective boxer than Rose Namajunas in Bec Rawlings. But moving a lot, forcing Rawlings to chase her, throwing things at her that she just had to move out of the way and react to, even if they weren't landing. I think that is fairly effective against a fighter like Rawlings. That's essentially what Sohee Ham did to Rawlings, albeit being much smaller, and landing a bit more. And so the effect is more or less the same. Van Zandt landed slightly less than Ham did in the first round, but carried a little more impact when she did connect because she's stronger and a better size for the division. Rawlings is definitely slowing down by round two. I think that's the main reason that kick landed, because Rawlings was slow to get out of range when earlier she had a really easy time of just stepping back and not being close enough for the second part of that two-touch kick to connect.
So I see what you're saying, and and in principle, I don't have a problem with doing things that make you less likely to win the round while thinking that they're going to pay off for later in the fight. I don't have any problem with that. My quibble is with this particular game plan, which I think her coaches should have looked at and said, I'm not sure that she has the skill to execute this. That's because yes, I can see how if she were a more skilled striker, you would absolutely want to stick and move on the outside and make Rawlings work and set those things up. The problem is she didn't do that.
I think it has to be a combination of coaches and Van Zandt herself. You know what really stood out to me was after this fight, Van Zandt came to her post-fight interview in the octagon, and she said that her coaches were telling her to quit throwing junk, and she didn't. She ended the fight with the junk they were talking about. Justin Buchholz was like, hey, stop with the junk. Let's get back to basics. So I don't know actually really if that first round was going according to plan. And then the crazy thing is that in trying to adjust the plan, they gave Van Zandt advice that she didn't feel the need to listen to, and she ended the fight doing the same thing she did in the first round. So that to me says that it's going to be very difficult for this team to work with Van Zandt and really change her in any effective way. I think she's probably just going to keep doing what she's doing because she's an athlete who is innately good at certain things and doesn't really have to be that good to succeed at the mid-level in this division.
That's okay. All of that is fair. I don't disagree with a single bit of that. I think the structure of that team contributes to that.
Yeah.
I think that it encourages freelancing and a lack of sticking to the game plan. I don't mean for this to come off quite that harsh. I think it's just real. I wanted to point out that I don't think that what was going on in that first round was a particularly productive was particularly productive, and the fact that the finish came in the second round shouldn't disguise that. That's all I wanted to get at.
You maybe, now that I think of it and just thinking of the fact that they were like, hey, stop doing what you're doing, do something different, you may be right. That it wasn't really that much of a cohesive plan to tire Rawlings out, and it was more like Van Zandt doing her own thing.
I mean, well, my guess is what they think of as game planning is the equivalent of what other camps do, kind of as a matter of course.
Mm-hmm.
Like so at Jackson's, for example, they watch tape before every mitt session. They go into every mitt session with a coherent plan of what they're going to try to accomplish and how it relates to the opponent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that, but that's for every mid session. That's not the overall comprehensive plan for the fight as a whole.
Those are specific tactics you're training. You're like, he's open for the right hand. Let's train the right hand counter to the jab.
Yeah, and Rafael Cordero does similar, and Rafael Cordero doesn't talk about it as much, but he does similar things.
Yeah.
Other coaches don't talk about it as much, but they do similar things. Zahabi does things like that. At ATT, they do things like that. I think that at Team Alpha Male, that's kind of the extent of the planning.
Yeah, having heard Justin Buckles in the corner, I kind of think he's a very tactically focused corner man. A lot of what he gives his fighters is like, okay, every time he jabs, he's bringing his left hand back low, so try to counter that. It's not so much, do you want to press the action, up your volume, or move around laterally, make him chase you, or shoot for takedowns, even if you don't get him, you're making him work. It's not big picture stuff. It's more tactical. It's, okay, he's open for this, go for this. And then when that doesn't work, the fighters, they kind of just resort to what they want to do. And I think that's probably what was happening for Van Zandt.
There's a lot of freelancing, and and the way they kind of run things is kind of freelancing.
Yeah.
Like that works for them because to some extent, because they're all so talented, and because that room breeds the ability for you to get better at what you already do well.
Yeah.
That's enough to beat a lot of fighters, and it produces a specific kind of fighter who is effective under very particular sets of circumstances.
As it has been for the last decade, it is a great place to become a very effective bridesmaid, not necessarily a place to become a bride, aka a champion.
Yeah. So real quick, do you have any thoughts on what Pretty Tony Pettis did to Charles Oliveira?
I'll tell you what, we're at like 30 minutes right now, so let's take a quick break, and let's talk about that when we come back and meld that into our discussion of Arlovski Barnett, which frankly doesn't have as much that I want to talk about as this card did. So let's take a quick break. When we come back, Pretty Tony Pettis in his featherweight debut, and then on to Arlovski, Barnett, Taylor, Lapilus, and possibly more.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
And we are back after a lengthy political discussion. Boy, wouldn't you at home have loved to have heard that. But unfortunately, it wasn't recorded, so it is what it is. Someday, Pat, I think we should initiate a sort of a pro version of the podcast where people pay extra money and they can hear all of the stupid shit that we talk about between breaks.
How are we going to divide up the show today? What topics go together? Also, my dog's gastrointestinal system.
Political discussions, everything that you really don't tune into this show to hear about. If you've basically become so much a fan of ours that you want to hear our bad opinions about everything not related to MMA, then the pro version is for you. So pro version of Heavy Hands coming soon.
Like we randomly discovered not that long ago that we were both big fans of the Total War series of computer games.
Yeah, we both also recently discovered that we both are avid readers of Joe Abercrombie's novels. We've been friends for like 2 years, and we talk about MMA so much that we never realized that we both are big fans of the same exact series of speculative fiction. So what can you do, Pat? Our lives are strange and sad, and if you pay $10 a month, you can be involved in them. So
far more so than you ever wanted to.
Yes.
Because again, along with those discussions, you would literally get me telling you about my dog's digestive tract, which is just the whole thing. Like, so
$10 a month is your fee for regret. So before we move on, we wanted to talk about UFC Hamburg, which is main evented by Andrei Arlovski and Josh Barnett. But before we move on, as mentioned before the break, we have one more fight from UFC on Fox 21 to discuss. That is Anthony Pettis' featherweight debut. I'm just going to go ahead and jump in here, Pat. I think personally, this kind of looked like the same Anthony Pettis to me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it kind of did. I think that he did a better job of pulling the trigger when he got open space.
Yeah, sure.
But that's him learning to make the most of his opportunities rather than him actively going about creating more opportunities.
We saw that in the Eddie Alvarez fight.
Yeah, same deal. Like, do I think that this? I mean, I don't want to underrate Charles Oliveira, because I think Oliveira came out with just demonstrably the correct game plan and did his very best to put himself in position to win the fight.
And he was also tougher than I gave him credit for.
Yeah, I mean, he got stung with those body kicks in the first round, and they took a lot out of him gas-wise. He'd never been a terribly a great cardio fighter, but yeah, I mean, I think you don't want to take too much away from Pettis, because Oliveira did exactly what he was supposed to do. He came out and he pressured effectively. He did a good job of sticking to Pettis like glue when he got in on a shot. He did a great job of creating opportunities to transition to the back, but eventually, I mean, I was surprised by the quality of Pettis's grappling, I guess. So if he's getting better at that, then that's fantastic. But if he's not going to wrestle you, if his grappling solely exists as a backup skill set to his striking, then what difference does that really make?
Yeah, the problem is that the grappling is reactive. Much like being a little more active in open space, it's more Pettis making the most of the opportunities he's given. Like, people are going to pressure him, they're going to out-grapple him, and so when they're not pressuring him, he's going to hit them more. When they're out-grappling him or out-wrestling him, then he is going to find opportunities to submit them and outwork them on the ground. What is he doing to prevent those... Ooh, Lucy in the background. What is he doing to prevent those difficulties from happening? You know, what is he doing strategically to make fights easier for himself? Because this was not an easy fight. You know, this was a fight in which he was tagged. He seemed to kind of run out of gas. That may be an aspect of the weight cut to featherweight, or it may be an aspect, it may be the fact that he was fighting in a lot of exhaustive grappling exchanges may have been a factor as well.
It was just a grueling fight, I think. I don't know that I read too much into that.
Yeah, but it was a difficult fight, and that's the thing. Like, even as he's been winning or not winning, even going back to the fight with Gilbert Melendez, Anthony Pettis has now not had an easy fight in almost 2 years. And it's been 5 fights. You know, Gilbert Melendez gave him trouble before Pettis, I don't want to say got lucky, but landed a good shot and changed the tone of the fight. And then 3 losses in a row. Even if we thought he beat Eddie Alvarez, it was not an easy fight for him. And then this fight was in a lot of ways very similar to that one, with Pettis managing to eke out the win. But what is it that makes Anthony Pettis, that causes Anthony Pettis to have so much difficulty with his opponents lately that wasn't a factor before 2014?
Pressure. It's just pressure. There's nothing particularly complicated about it. I think it's just pressure. It's that, with the exception of Edson Barboza, and I'll come back to that in a second, with the exception of Barboza, the rest of those opponents have figured out that when you push Pettis back to the fence, he is either doesn't have a sense of urgency to disengage, doesn't know how to doesn't know how to disengage properly with anything like there's a fire under him. You know, that's just he's kind of content to stay there for way too long, and I don't know what you need to do to get him a sense of urgency and knowing that he needs to get off. Barboza, I think, did something much more impressive, which was just beat Pettis up at range. He was just sharper, and he worked faster, and he threw more volume. He was sharper in exchanges. Like, that's almost a more worrisome problem for Pettis.
Sure.
Is that it's no longer that even if you're given the space that you really want to operate, that's just an auto win for you.
Yeah, well, for both Alvarez, Dos Anjos, and even Melendez in this fight, The problems were both, I think, mental and physical, technical, where that Pettis wasn't urgent enough in the moments he had, wasn't urgent enough in his efforts to escape the fence, but also that Pettis was not technical enough to make those things happen. Edson Barboza was really just the one. Was the technicality, was how good is Anthony Pettis' footwork, how good is his boxing, really, his defense and his striking with his hands to back up the dynamic kicking game. Really, I think what we saw in this fight is that Pettis is still dangerous, and I don't think we ever doubted that. He can still, if you give him space, he will hurt you. He is extremely fast. He's very creative with his offense, both striking and on the ground. But really, in this fight, it was that Pettis... You have to respect Pettis. You have to give him the respect that he seems to feel he is owed in order to be beaten by him. And that there's not a lot of aspects in his game that force you to respect him. If you come into a fight with Pettis saying, yeah, he's going to kick me if I give him space, you know what? I'm not going to give him space. Then Pettis has trouble making that space. He has trouble forcing you to back up. He has trouble forcing you to respect what he brings to the table. He doesn't have a lot of ancillary tools and tactics to enhance that dangerous kicking game.
The opponent is under no obligation to agree to fight Anthony Pettis the way that he wants to be fought, and that seems to be a hump that Pettis has never really gotten over.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's kind of the Mike Winklejohn problem, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like there are other fighters too who are kind of happy to flow where the fight wants, where the fight goes. Shogun is like that a little bit. Like Shogun, if you take Shogun down, he's like, okay, that's fine. We can grapple for a while now, and maybe I get on top, or maybe I work a deep half guard and get back to my feet. But if we're grappling, we're grappling. That's cool. We can make that happen. That's a thing that we can do. Oh, you want to fight in the pocket? Okay, we can fight in the pocket. Oh, you want to kickbox at range? We can kickbox at range. Like there is a genre of fighter who is just kind of like ready to go however you want the fight to go. He'll fight you there. And that creates real problems when there is a defined book on how to beat you.
Yeah.
And because it turns out, for the most part, Shogun can make that kind of game work. He's fighting in a shallower weight class against less skilled opposition, and even at his current age, he is still unbelievably fast and hits unbelievably hard.
His margin for error is much smaller than Pettis's.
Much larger than Pettis's.
Much larger, sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, and Pettis fighting the cream of the lightweight and now the featherweight divisions does not have that kind of margin for error. And there are plenty of guys who, even if they are not pressure fighters per se, know perfectly well how to impose a pressuring game plan when they need to. Like Eddie Alvarez. Eddie Alvarez is not big on pressure. That is not really his jam. But he's skilled enough that he can do it when he needs to. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to find many guys at featherweight or lightweight in the UFC who can't do that, who just do not know how to pressure or are so bad at it that you can get away from them. So I don't want to sound down on Anthony Pettis because I still love him as a fighter. When he gets the space to create offense, it is unbelievably dynamic offense. But he needs Brandon Gibson to do to him what Gibson has done to Donald Cerrone.
Right. And maybe that's the biggest change in this modern era of MMA is that fighters, the level of training has become good enough that fighters can, when necessary, sort of fight against type. That they're not just going to fall into the traps, and even in small ways. Like, it doesn't take a lot to go into a fight with a guy like Anthony Pettis and say, all right, I'm naturally an outfighter, but I'm going to put a little more pressure on him this time. I'm going to force him to act a little more than he normally would. And I'm going to condition myself through my sparring not to worry about the stuff he's throwing me at range, because I know that if I move through that range, he will be less effective. Even if it's scary to get through that range, I'm going to get through it. And that is what we're seeing with a lot of the guys that fought Anthony Pettis. It almost seemed to be a thing overnight, but it wasn't really. Like I said, the Gilbert Melendez fight kind of presaged the problems that Anthony Pettis would have. Melendez is an old school fighter himself, but one who is smart enough to make adjustments, as proven by the fact that he has continued to hang with a lot of very good modern fighters despite losing a lot of his recent fights. He's always competitive because he's smart. He knows that he needs to make certain small, subtle changes for each opponent. And the fact that now that Anthony Pettis is consistently finding opponents who are used to making those changes from one fight to the next, he just can't go in there and just be Anthony Pettis anymore. And I think that has always been sort of the source of Pettis' confidence, is that he, in the past, has always known he can go in there and just be Showtime and beat people, that they can't hang with that. And that is not the case anymore. So whether or not Anthony Pettis can adapt to that sort of answers the question of, can he continue to be, or can he once again become a contender, or is he basically just going to be an action fighter who is not in the title picture? Which is a crazy, right? That's a plummet from where he was even 1 year ago. This guy, he became champion, and in like the space of a year and a half, he's no longer even in the discussion.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because stylistically, I think Pettis, even when Pettis was at the peak of his game, in like the end of 2010 through say the beginning of 2015, leaving aside the loss to Guida, even when Pettis was like at the very top of the world, I think he was still kind of a throwback fighter then.
Yeah.
I think that the fighter with whom he has the most in common is kind of Anderson Silva in a lot of ways, a very low volume, low output approach, but not like young Anderson Silva who put on a lot of pressure and worked fast, like kind of old Anderson Silva.
Sure.
And that worked for Anderson Silva because Anderson was Anderson, and because he had a lifetime of experience to put all these things to use, and because he was a middleweight, he wasn't fighting guys at the very, very, very top of the skill-wise talent pool in all of MMA.
Yeah.
But Pettis kind of tried to be that guy, fighting a much deeper crop of competition and not really having grown an immense amount since then.
It's like the Maurice Smith tactic, right? It's like the first wave of kickboxers. They're like, all right, all these guys are, the guys who beat me are wrestlers, so I'm just going to smack their heads off the moment I get enough space. But that's like, Maurice Smith was kind of doing a basic version of what Anderson Silva did during his title run a decade before. And to try and make that work in today's era is there's just too many new adaptations in the way of that.
Yeah, I mean, contrast what Anthony Pettis did when Oliveira shoved him up against the fence over and over and over again with what Joanna Jędrzejczyk did to Claudia Gadelha when she shoved her up against the fence, or what Robbie Lawler did when multiple opponents when Johnny Hendricks tried to smother him.
Right. It's
like,
basic. It's like you've stopped the takedown. Now what?
Yeah, you've got to, like, what the game that's being played right now is either you hurt your opponent in that scenario or you immediately disengage.
Yeah.
And Pettis just does, he just doesn't kind of have that sense of urgency. I don't know. Like, I love Anthony Pettis, and he's so dynamic, and there's nothing that says that he can't fix some of those problems. It's just like as time goes on, he's going to get a little slower. He's going to be a little less dynamic. And if he's not growing, then he is going to drop off. I don't know. Yeah. It's sad. It really genuinely makes me sad to think that he's not getting better.
He's good enough to fix those problems, but again, these problems have been present for almost 3 years now. We have known that these are problems that are really facing him, and he could become better technically. He could improve his footwork. He could improve his feinting game and prevent those situations from happening. That's kind of the Michael Bisping approach. You make it so the other guy can't wrestle you, and that way you have more success in defending his takedowns, because when they do come, they're coming from disadvantageous positions. Or you make it so that you are a better wrestler. Like Joanna Jędrzejczyk, you hurt the guy as he's trying to wrestle you, and you become skilled enough that you can disengage. It's either urgency or technique, and Pettis doesn't really seem to be making strides in either area. So it's tough. I agree with you. It's kind of sad to watch the fall of Anthony Pettis. This has kind of become a narrative, I guess, for the podcast. We've been sort of tracking his descent as a fighter. We of course have talked about all of his fights since the Gilbert Melendez one, and both of us thinking he narrowly won the Eddie Alvarez fight, but not really being heartened by the performance he put on. Both of us thinking that Barboza was going to beat him, and then both of us thinking that he had an innate stylistic advantage against Oliveira, but that he was probably going to have trouble in the fight. I think we have a pretty good read on him. So as podcasters, it'll be fun and interesting to continue following Anthony Pettis, but as fight fans, it kind of sucks to just kind of watch him struggle so mightily with the same problems over and over again. So we'll have to see if he continues to make any improvements. I don't know that the featherweight weight class offers him any superior opportunities compared to lightweight. Doesn't really seem like it's going to be that different. Maybe he'll have an easier time of out wrestling his opponents, but again, like a lot of Anthony Pettis' problems has not been that he can't out wrestle them, it's that he doesn't have the urgency to out wrestle them. He doesn't realize the importance of it. So we shall see. But we'll leave that one behind us. Anthony Pettis will be fighting again, so we can talk about his progression. We can follow the story of Showtime further. Then, for now, Pat, let's talk a little bit about Arlovski versus Barnett, the main event of UFC Fight Night Hamburg.
Interesting fight. Really interesting fight, actually.
Especially
by the standards of heavyweight MMA at this in the year of our Lord 2016.
You've been doing your Fall of Rome podcast too much.
Yeah. Well, what makes it really interesting to me is that Barnett is not like a big puncher. So, and that has been Arlovski's problem. Arlovski has the skills to hang with just about anybody in the heavyweight division. The question is whether he's going to get sparked.
Yeah.
So because he's been competitive with everybody, even in fights where he has been sparked, he's been competitive. So if he's facing somebody who isn't likely to put him out, who is not a huge puncher, who is not really a finishing artist on the feet, who's going to work at pace with him, I think this has a chance to be a really, really, really entertaining, fun fight, and maybe even go to a decision.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we have Barnett, who is a sort of underrated striker. I think Barnett's a pretty good volume kickboxer. I've never heard anybody else mention this, and so I feel like I've brought it up 100 times more than I should. But I thought Barnett put on a good performance when he fought Daniel Cormier in the main event of the final Strikeforce event. It was Strikeforce Barnett versus Cormier in 2012. I thought that was a fight.
Not the final Strikeforce event. The last one that had heavyweights, I think.
Oh, was there one after it?
Oh, there were a bunch after it. They didn't go out until 2013.
You are correct. My God. How did I forget that? It felt like a good final event. It had Barnett, Cormier, and it also had Thompson, Melendez 3, right?
Maybe. It was the finale of their heavyweight Grand Prix.
So I'm thinking of something different. Maybe I'm thinking of... Oh, Pat, I'm all over the place.
No, it wasn't even the final event that had heavyweights on it, because Barnett fought Nandor Guelmino, if memory serves, also on a strike, and Cormier.
I'm confusing it with Marquardt Safadine, which followed, which was the final event, and that also was that one Melendez. No,
I don't think so.
I'm all over the damn place here.
Okay, leaving that aside, you thought Josh Barnett fought well against Daniel Cormier, and I
thought he fought well. He boxed well. He lost his jab really and his left hook in the first 45 seconds of the fight, breaking his left hand on Daniel Cormier's hard skull, and I thought he comported himself very well. He showed that he was a tough, adaptive fighter. Despite his sort of appearance, I guess he looks like a pretty typical heavyweight. He's kind of flabby. He's a big guy. He can go for rounds, and he showed that again. That's still a trait of his. He demonstrated that in his very impressive fight with Roy Nelson, in which Roy Nelson came in unprecedentedly good form as well. And so Barnett can be this sort of boxer puncher, a sort of volume out fighter. He can do that game. But in this matchup, again, we have Arlovski is a much more powerful fighter against Barnett, who is not that powerful but puts out a lot of volume, is tough, and has an okay wrestling game to fall back on. So I think for the most part, this fight takes place on the feet, and so we have the volume and the probing attack of Josh Barnett versus the more patient, more powerful counterpunching attack of Andrei Arlovski. And Pat, I think I'm going to go with Arlovski. What do you think?
With you on that. I can see that.
You agree? That was not a whom that suggested agreement.
No, I'm going to pick Barnett simply because I think he does throw more. And for me, I don't think that this is going to go to the ground. I think you're right about that. Barnett is much more of a grappler than a takedown artist. And Arlovski's takedown defense is as good as it's ever been, if not better. You have got to be a really, really good takedown artist to easily get Arlovski to the canvas. And I don't think that Barnett in 2016 is that guy. But I think a lot of the fight is going to take place in the clinch. And Arlovski is an excellent clinch fighter. He's very good at stifling his opponent's clinch offense. But I think Barnett is on a whole other level. than the clinch fighters that Arlovski has faced.
Technically, with the variety of his attack, he's one of the best clinch fighters in this division.
Yeah, especially up against the fence, and Arlovski is happy to engage in the clinch up against the fence. Alistair Overeem got his best work prior to the actual finish. I think he got his best work done in the clinch against Arlovski. And if Overeem, even the diminished version of Overeem, can kind of muscle you around a little bit and find opportunities to land, I think Barnett can as well. So that is my thought. I don't think it's a finish, but I like Barnett to win like a 49-46 decision.
Yeah, to me, I see Arlovski he's not a fighter who tends to gas. His fight with Frank Mir was incredibly slow, but that was really because Frank Mir gassed and stopped attacking. And Arlovski, more and more, as he's become an older fighter, has fallen into his niche as a counter puncher. And so I think Barnett, if he fights him anything like he did Roy Nelson, is going to keep trying to close that distance, is going to keep throwing. I can see that strategic advantage you're talking about, Pat, but specifically, I think that Arlovski is going to find an exchange in which he connects with something big. He's got a very basic game, but again, at heavyweight, basic things work especially well. There's more power, there's less durability relative to that power. You need fundamentals at heavyweight. Being able to move laterally, block, and land big punches as counters, that stuff carries you a long way. And I think it's going to work for Arlovski. I think Barnett's going to come forward. He's going to try to put volume on him. And not being an amazing defensive fighter, I think he's going to get caught with a right hand or a right uppercut and put away. So
he's kind of a sneaky good defensive fighter. It's not easy to catch Barnett cleanly, and he is and always has been a really tough, really durable guy.
He likes his 52 block style defense with the elbow guards and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's crafty. I'm a fan of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to blow you out of the water for your Arlovski pick. I just think for me the balance falls a little more toward Barnett, especially if Arlovski were to tire later in the fight and Barnett were able to get a takedown. He would have a big advantage if it did go to the mat. So
unless you're like a member of the teams of the fighters, is it possible to really get that incensed about this fight one way or the other? It's just like a fun heavyweight fight. Both of these guys have had some losses. Let's see who wins.
They have a combined 36 years of MMA experience.
Holy shit, is that real?
Yeah, Josh Barnett had his first professional fight in January of 1997, and Arlovski was in early 1999.
My God.
Yeah, it's crazy. So what else interested you on this card, though, Connor?
Taylor Lapulus. That's the one thing that really stands out to me. There's one other thing that we're not going to break down, but we'll give a bit of a shout out. But as far as someone who is a developing fighter, and I kind of feel like I know where they stand in the UFC, Taylor Lapulus is the bantamweight division is just bananas these days. It is so good, and Lapulus it almost feels like he's gotten lost in the mix because we've got guys like Jimmy Rivera and Cody Garbrandt and Tomas Almeida, all these really exciting power punchers coming up. But Lapulus is a very solid, consistent style of fighter, and I'm interested to see as he fights Leandro Issa how he continues to develop that style. I think Issa's a good fight for him. It's sort of a comeback after a really tough fight with who's Dominic Cruz's little protege, Eric Perez. I'm interested to see how Lapulus comes back from that. How about you, Pat?
I too am very interested in Taylor Lapulus. I've thought for a long time that he's going to be a good fighter. His brother is a very good kind of regional journeyman who fought Joe Duffy in Cage Warriors a couple of years ago.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was Duffy's. I think it was Duffy's first fight back after his layoff. So his brother is a talented, skilled, very skilled journeyman. Lapulus is much more talented than his brother is, But yeah, I mean, I like his game a lot. He does really interesting things. He goes very well from punches to kicks and kicks to punches. He plays kind of a movement heavy, what I would call a movement heavy Dutch style game. A lot of combinations, a lot of using punches to mask kicks. Really nice angles. He takes really great angles, and then in the clinch, he is way stronger and way more imposing than a guy who's not huge for the division. He's 5'6". He's way more imposing in the clinch than he has any right to be. He does a really great job of using frames to create space and land knees, even with his back to the fence. He is very, very dangerous on the feet at range and in the clinch. He plays a tricky game. He's got a tricky rhythm. He understands how to manipulate rhythm, which is not true for a lot of young fighters.
Yeah.
So you got to like that about him. He's also like, he's 23 or is he 24 now? He is not, he's turned 24. So he's young. He's got a lot of upside. He's athletic. He's got exceptional takedown defense. He's got very, very good takedown defense as well. So I think he's one of the brighter young fighters coming out of France these days. He's the kind of guy that I think someday you're going to be able to build a card around.
Yeah, I'll tell you who he really reminds me of. You talk about sort of adapted Dutch kickboxing. He reminds me of Michael Johnson when Michael Johnson goes on the move and fights a little more defensively. Like Michael Johnson versus Joe Lozon. That's kind of what he looks like to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That hadn't occurred to me. I think I think Lapilus is a little less of a freakish athlete. I think Johnson is a really, really top shelf kind of physical specimen. Yeah. Lapilus is not quite on that level. But very similar kind of games. You're absolutely right.
The approach is like it's punch kick combinations. It's like these basic building blocks of international kickboxing, Dutch style kickboxing, which makes sense. France has produced a lot of good fighters in that realm, as well as a lot of good Muay Thai fighters. One of the best European countries for actual Thai style Muay Thai fighters. But then it's a little more mobile, a little more defensive, more specialized for sort of an anti-grappling range. And that's what has made Lapilus so successful so far. The big problem that crept up in his fight with Eric Perez is that it seemed almost to be a thin veneer, you know what I mean, of what Lapilus has done to be effective. It's almost like he reminded me also of Ioane and Jacek, sort of that sort of anti-wrestlers style of striking. But then fighting Eric Perez, he finally fought a wrestler so tenacious that he kind of reverted to being a guard player. Kept jumping on submissions, kept dropping to his back. I think that seems to me like a problem that experience will fix, that he just needed to kind of stick to his guns and not give in to what Eric Perez wanted him to do, not accept that grappling style of fighting. But Issa will be a good opponent to test that, because Issa is going to try to take Lapilus down. It's sort of a step back for him. But Issa's tough. He comes forward. He's going to look for the clinch. He's going to look to drag Lapilus to the ground. The big question in this fight will be, does Lapilus accept that kind of fight and try to fight a grappler's anti-grappler game, or does he try to make the grappler contend with him in a striking battle like Jędrzejczyk and Johnson do?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of confidence in Lapilus's ability to beat Issa here. I mean, I think that especially because Issa gets so many of his takedowns from the clinch.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that he's going to be able to work clinch takedowns against Lapilus. Though Issa is an extremely talented grappler, if he does get the fight to the ground, Lapilus is in much more trouble than he was there against Eric Perez.
Sure, yeah. But it is more, as a total matchup, it's more like Oka Sasaki than it is like Eric Perez.
Yeah, absolutely. Perez is by far the most imposing striker that Lapilus has ever faced. And also worth noting for that, Lapilus came in on something like 2 weeks' notice to fight Perez. He had very little notice. He hadn't had a full camp. He was so he wore down. Part of the reason I think he was going for those submissions is because he knew he didn't have the gas to keep fighting at the pace that he wanted to keep.
He knew he couldn't fight the takedown, so he was like, I'm going to make the best of this. I'm going to go for not the puncher's chance, but the grappler's chance.
Yeah, and he's Lapilus is a guy who likes to play kind of a high volume game at range. He likes to throw 12 to 15 strikes a minute. And I think he realized after about the first 6 minutes of the fight that was not going to be a viable thing for him over 3 rounds, because he won the first round of that fight. He won the first round pretty handily.
Yeah, but Perez pushes a pace, man. That is one thing he does very well.
Yeah. So, but that's about all I had for that card. We had a shout out though.
Alex Enland is making his UFC debut. Pat, you scouted Alex Enland back when you did your prospect series on the Future Champion series for Bloody Elbow. Is that correct?
Yeah, he came just shy of the top 25 in that series.
Yeah. So you have looked at Alex Enland in the past. I have worked with Alex Enland in the past. I've done some private work for him. He is a featherweight who is, I guess, currently still the Cage Warriors featherweight champion, though I'm sure that title will be vacated once he makes his debut. But he is a great guy, very genuine person, very smart, cerebral fighter, and very skilled, very dangerous as a fighter. Has finished the vast majority of his opponents. Great submission artist.
making rapid improvements as far as boxing and striking goes, and he's debuting against Martin Bushkamp. So we're not going to talk about it in depth just yet, though we may have time for that on next week's episode after his debut. But we encourage you as friends and fans of Alex's to check him out, because I didn't even realize until I was doing my Sherdog preview for this card. It's like, holy shit, Alex Enlund is here. It snuck up on me. He hadn't told me about it. I know he's been waiting to get in the UFC for years, so I'm very happy for him. And again, I really encourage everyone listening to make sure you watch that fight, even if after the fact. Alex is very talented. I think he's destined for big things in the UFC.
Yeah, so is he our first regular or semi-regular heavy hands listener to get into the UFC?
I think he might be, yeah, because he listens to the show on a fairly regular basis. I really think he might be. I don't know of any other active UFC fighters who are consistently listening to episodes from one week to the next. So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. It's good stuff. Let's take one more break, Pat. When we come back, we have some questions we want to answer from listeners, and then we'll get out of here. Again, congratulations, Alex. Can't wait to see you fight, bud.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
And we are back. Quick final segment here. We apologize, but we have had so much fun talking about everything today, we just couldn't contain ourselves. Before we get into our heavy bag questions, I want to name some of the people who are responsible for them. These people donated $3 or more to Heavy Hands in the month of July, and so I have to thank them, and we really do appreciate it, guys. Taylor Haskell, Thaddeus Pryor, Alan Calder, Dan Barkhoff, Thomas Lindstad, Tom Grant, our friend, who put out a really nice breakdown on Demian Maia's guard passing against Carlos Condit, so check that out on bloodyelbow.com. Jeff Newman, Gare or Gar, Lorenzo Wong, Theodore Bricker, Justin Wilson, Reed M. Kellner, Jorge Cabrera, Carl Calmer, Owen, and Robert Garside. Thank you very much, guys. We really do appreciate your support. If you want to support Heavy Hands on Patreon, you can just find us, search Heavy Hands on Patreon. We have lots of rewards available, and we answer your questions on the show, and that's what we're going to do for this final segment. We have a couple of questions from listeners. Let's see. Our first one here is from Axel Holt, who's been supporting us for a very long time. Axel asks, I assume there will be kids. Oh, I didn't do the heavy bag question, Pat. God damn it.
Well, we're not talking about the sound effect anymore. We're talking about the sound effect.
That's right. We received surveys. People don't like when we talk about the sound effect. They probably do like when we play it, but we're going to do neither on today's episode. Our first question comes to us from Axel Holt. He asks, I assume there will be kids starting to train purely focused on MMA these days. How do you think they will do compared to the ones coming over from a pure boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, or Thai background, etc.? Better at transitions and mixing techniques, more jack of all trades, master of none, etc. What do you think, Pat? MMA natives versus specialists.
That's a really interesting question. And a few years ago, I think the unanimous answer from me and pretty much everybody else would have been that the MMA natives are going to have an advantage over their compatriots who come over from other combat sports. And now I am not sure that that is the case. I'm not sure that I agree. I think we have kind of seen the limits of where jack of all trade dumb can get you. If you're going to be an MMA native, I think you really need to have an area in which you specialize, an area where you're better at that than everything else. Because at this point, there's nobody who doesn't know at least a little bit about everything, except for maybe the lowest levels of heavyweight or light heavyweight or like really thin weight classes in the UFC. I think everybody pretty much has a basic idea of, everybody knows how to shoot a double leg. Everybody knows how a guard pass works. Everybody knows a triangle choke. Everybody knows a guillotine. Everybody knows how to throw, well, most people know how to throw a jab. But like, everybody has a basic command of everything. So just predicating your success on the fact that you know how to do everything doesn't get you very far.
Yeah.
Right? Like everybody knows how to sprawl. Everybody knows how to stuff a single
And
leg.
mostly too, it's that knowing how to defend things is generally much easier than knowing how to make those things happen.
Yes, that is an exceptionally important
Like, I can
point
stand far enough away that your boxing is null and just kick your legs. I can keep my elbows tight and play conservative on the ground and keep you from taking my arm. It's much easier to learn what not to do on a basic level than it is learning how to finish someone in any of those specific phases.
Yeah, so I would say if you're going to be an MMA native and expect to kind of ride well-roundedness to the very top, you had better be just a ballistic level athlete. You had better be an off the charts athletic specimen. So I'll give you an example of this. Mirsad Bektic, who does not really have a specialized skill set. He's a good technical wrestler. He's a good grappler. He's a good striker, but none of those is really an outstanding skill set.
Yeah.
Where he really stands out is in the fact that he is a physical monster with unreal athleticism, explosiveness, and power.
Yeah.
So he can make that kind of well-rounded game work where the transitions are important and everything flows from one phase into the next. But mostly it works because he's so fast that it reinforces his craft.
Sure. But you know what? Even then, Pat, I would say that Mirsad Bektic is somewhat specialized. Stylistically, he wants to take you down and beat you up from top position.
That's true. That's a fair point. Like
how many people has Mirsad Bektic fought that he hasn't taken down and controlled for the majority of several rounds? How many guys has he beaten without doing that?
That's true. That's true. So you would say he is a specialized top player.
Sure.
I think that's totally fair.
So
he has an outstanding top game.
Yeah. So I think really the thing is that there are some advantages to being an MMA native, but going into any kind of combat sport with the notion that you're just going to be better at everything than the other guy, even just from a basic stance of time commitment, it's never going to work. If you're going to say, I'm going to be a better puncher and have better footwork and have, if you spend all this time focusing on doing all of these things, someone is going to be so good at one area, they're going to beat you in that area. They're going to know how to make that specific pocket of effectiveness occur. And so being well-rounded is fantastic. Coming up from a background of MMA, that gives you edges in experience. It allows you to transition. It allows you to be more comfortable defending in every area. But you are still, like a boxer who learns what he's most effective doing, you're still going to find what style of fighting suits you best. You're still going to have your own style. And trying to not have a style is going to be more of a weakness than a strength. And so for guys like Mirsad Bektic, being a crazy good athlete and everything and being super well-rounded is fantastic, but he still knows what he's best at going into a fight.
He knows what his bread and butter is.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, I'll give you a couple of different examples of ways that this could go. So Sage Northcutt, despite his background in sport karate or whatever, and calling himself a world karate champion or whatever, is basically an MMA native.
Yeah.
He is, and what I mean by that is his game relies entirely on transitions. His game is predicated entirely on using strikes to distract from takedowns, wrestling scrambles to disguise you or wrestling style scrambles to disguise from the fact that he's trying to get to your back or he's looking for your neck for a choke.
We talk about the advantages that MMA natives have. Those advantages are like the entire core of Northcutt's game.
Exactly. And they play off his physicality and his speed and his gifts in that regard. But the problem is, if you shut those transitions down, he does not have enough depth of skill in any individual areas to contend. And we saw that really clearly against Brian Barberena, that there's just a lot of stuff that he doesn't know. And if you're that good at throwing punches to a double leg, then you probably don't know the intricacies of finishing a double leg against somebody who has a really, really good defensive wrestling game.
Whether you force him to strike from long range, or you force him to fight in the clinch, or you force him to grapple solely from his back, if he's trapped in one area, that well-roundedness becomes his enemy because he doesn't have that depth of skill in any one area to really press his advantage when it does occur.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Rory McDonald, who has a great depth, who is the fundamental all-terrain fighter and has a great depth of skill in every area, but is not an off-the-charts kind of world-class athlete. And when Rory McDonald has run into trouble, it's been against guys who can outpower him, outspeed him, or who can force him to stick in one phase, like as with Northcutt, but where he doesn't have the kind of raw physical horsepower to compete.
Yeah.
So those are so with all of that said, being an MMA native isn't a bad thing. It's just you need to have one thing that you're really good at too, where you can say, okay, all other things being equal, I am perfectly comfortable having nothing but a 3-round striking match. I think I can beat just about anybody in a 3-round striking match.
Yeah, no matter how comfortable you are in all aspects, you are going to still have a style. You're going to have certain strengths and weaknesses that suit you as a person. It's based on your personality. And changing that style is, like being a perfectly well-rounded fighter is as difficult as being a perfectly well-rounded person. You're always going to have specific things that piss you off, certain pet peeves. You're going to have certain weaknesses. You just can't be a perfect person, and it's that as difficult to be a perfect fighter. So specialization within well-roundedness is still going to be key. Our final question, thank you again, Axel, for that question. Our final question comes to us from Andreas Lagarde. He says, how do you think the point fighting outfighter revolution happening right now in MMA will end? Will it be the Weidman way of walking down and cutting off the cage against Machida and Anderson, or Shogun's body attacks against the retreating Machida, or is point fighting here to stay at a very viable and possibly even dominant stand-up style for MMA?
Whew, that's a mouthful. So basically, what we've seen is the pendulum swing away from pressure and towards outside fighting recently, right? Like I think that's the core of that.
And so, you could definitely say that it's a reaction to the fact that pressure fighters have become more effective.
Yeah, exactly. So I think how does this end? I think that we see more fighters who are capable of playing kind of that kind of stick and move outside game, but I also think that pressure fighters are going to get better too, and the outside fighters who are not at the very top of the heap are going to end up getting walked down and beaten up too.
Sure.
So like a lot of these things are problems with pressure footwork, and we talked about this with McGregor and Diaz last week, but or was it last week? Was that only last week?
Time is distorted in the MMA vortex, Pat.
Dude, time is distorted in the baby vortex, man. Like I have no sense of when things are happening.
I'm slightly drunk. You have a baby. We're basically in the same position as far as awareness of the surrounding world goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, where were we? Outside fighters. Yeah. So right. We talked about the limits of Nate Diaz's pressure in that fight, but it would not have taken Rafael dos Anjos to shut down the kind of sticking and moving that McGregor was trying to do in the 4th and 5th round of that fight. Mm-hmm. So there are going to be adjustments that get made. And I think that Dos Anjos, too, despite losing to Eddie Alvarez, who was trying to stick and move against him, I think given enough time, Dos Anjos would have succeeded at various points in walking Alvarez down and getting some work done against the fence.
Yeah.
This is not an unbeatable style. I think every so often when we see one of these kind of metagame revolutions happening, people think, okay, this is it. Now we need to make some big grand statements about what we've learned about MMA as a whole.
It's the Machida era.
Yeah, it's just these are back and forth things that we're going to learn. The different fighters are going to learn how to deal with. And somebody like Stephen Thompson, I think that there are very few fighters in all of MMA who are going to be able to ever successfully walk him down and pin him against the fence. But somebody who's trying to play an outside fighting game, like let's say Holly Holm tries to stick and move against Amanda Nunes, I think Amanda Nunes could walk Holly Holm down. This is not an unbeatable style that's never gonna that is absolutely never going to be overcome. It's just that there are going to be some circumstances where it works based on the quality of the fighters, and some circumstances where it doesn't.
Yeah, and you're always going to have intrinsic, you're going to have ancillary things that affect a style matchup too, right? Like Holly Holm might have an advantage for a decision over Amanda Nunes because she has better stamina. Stylistically, Amanda Nunes might have the style to beat Holly Holm. It's like taking Conor McGregor against Nate Diaz. Without McGregor gassing, we'd probably favor McGregor over Diaz. But stylistically, there are all these little aspects that go into it. I'll tell you one thing, Pat, is I kind of balk at the designation of this style as point fighting. I guess it makes sense from a certain standpoint in that it's not as geared towards knocking somebody's head off as other styles of fighting are. But fighting from long range, controlling distance, walking the other person into strike, sort of forcing them to be uncomfortable in open space. I mean, I don't know. I guess the reason that I think that Andreas calls it point fighting is that it comes from sort of point fighting, like point karate, full contact kickboxing, things like that, where you get resets after you score and everything. But really, like, every fighter is concerned with winning points. Any combat sport, whether it's wrestling, you could say that wrestling is more point fighting even than full contact kickboxing.
Well, yeah, sure, but I think like in this context, it's just that we're seeing so much more sport karate influence and
Sure.
like karate point fighting influence that it's natural to associate it. But I'll say this, like I think even if you acknowledge that most of this revolution has to do with basic boxing footwork, like I don't think that it's about a karate influence. I think it's fighters doing a better job of pivoting and understanding that after they throw is when you move. Like these are not complicated things that are enabling this. Like you only get the space to throw like some spinning shit if you know how to use your feet to keep your back off the fence.
Yeah.
Like that's what this is about. It's about footwork and movement and the sense of urgency to know when you need to move.
But that's why fighting is eternally fascinating, Pat, is that you can have the same, quote unquote revolutions happen over and over again because intrinsically taking part in a combat sport, you're going to be battling yourself. You're going to be battling your own instincts and your own urges. You're going to be trying to learn a style that goes against what innately you want to do, and you're going to be building that style off of the generations that fought the same fight before you. It's always interesting, right, to watch fighters like find adaptations to pressure fighters. It's not a secret. We've seen it for centuries, how fighters deal with that style of fighting. But there's always going to be tiny little wrinkles that feel new, even if they've been done before. So what is, Pat, do you think, the counter to the new era of outfighters, if we can call it that?
Two things. I think better pressure footwork of the type that we've seen historically from Dos Anjos, but I think there are very few fighters who have that kind of technical skill.
Sure.
As far as pressuring is concerned, I think he's way up there. I think McGregor is up there too. When McGregor decides to move forward, I think he is an exceptional pressure fighter. But I think the big one is countering. And again, I think like this is where McGregor is right on the bleeding edge.
Yeah.
Of that.
That was
his
big change against Diaz was just relying more on countering, taking away the outfighter's frustrating weapons.
Exactly. Yeah. So what an outfighter needs is space. And the reason that the outsider is throwing when they get into particular situations is to create an opening to move, to get that space back. You can take that particular component of it away by countering when they throw. So you make them either hesitant to throw, which leaves them on the fence, or you punish them when they try to throw. One of the two. Either way, it works for you. That I think is the big response.
Yeah, I agree with you. Okay. Well, thank you, Andreas, for the question. Thank you again to Axel, and thank you to all of you who contributed to the show. We have a couple other of heavy bag questions here on the Patreon page. And again, if you contributed to the show 3 months ago and have had your question answered, feel free to submit another one. We have like a 3-month turnaround time before we end up getting some new questions. So feel free to submit a new one whenever we've run out of ideas. And if you want to support Heavy Hands on Patreon, then go ahead. Feel free. We appreciate your support, and we are happy to talk about all of your ideas on the show. Otherwise, you can find us on social media to get in touch. I am at BoxingBush, B-U-S-C-H, on Twitter. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman. You can also find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Connor Ruebusch MMA. I will let you discern how to spell that. Pat, do you have anything coming out this week you want everyone to know about?
Not a ton. I'm kind of on limited duty. I'm on like semi-paternity leave right now.
Sure.
But I have a preview of this weekend's upcoming UFC Hamburg card coming out. I will have another episode of the Fall of Rome podcast coming out towards the end of this week, Thursday or Friday. And I don't think it'll be this week. It'll probably be early next week before our next show. But I'm working on a big kind of research piece on UFC pay-per-view buys and drawing power. Trying to figure out who are the biggest draws, what kind of trends do we see in that data. It'll be a fairly dense kind of piece on the business side, but I know some of our listeners are into that. Also, if you haven't already, check out the last episode of the Fall of Rome podcast. Went up last Friday. We were talking about the Goths and the Battle of Adrianople, the worst Roman military disaster in more than 350 years. So check that out.
Very cool. Pat, the other thing I wanted to mention before I say, well, I guess I'll say this first. I'm doing an article on Demian Maia this week and a Sherdog preview of UFC Hamburg, Arlovski versus Barnett. That's all I have planned at the moment, so check those out when they arrive. But we also have a survey out right now. We are looking at trying to monetize the show, get a little advertisers, and we need to know what you guys are interested in. So there's a survey link out there. We will attach it to the description of this episode on both Bloody Elbow and HeavyHandsPodcast.com. You can also find it on our respective Twitter pages. If you are a fan of the show, if you've been listening for some time, or even if you're a new listener, please take a few minutes. How many questions are on that survey, Pat?
9 questions.
9 questions. It'll take literally 1.5 minutes of your time. We really do appreciate it. It'll just basically let us know who our audience for this show is. One thing we do know, you're mostly male. So this is why Pat and I are very lucky to both of us have women in our lives, because evidently the stuff we like to talk about, mostly for dudes. It's very largely for a male audience.
I mean, I figured that our audience would be mostly male. I don't think I thought that it would be as male as it is.
It's like
98.2%, if we're being precise about it.
Sausage party here in the Heavy Hands. So thank you guys for joining us. I can now say that without any insecurities. Thank you especially to the 3 women that listen to our show. We really do appreciate it. If you guys came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.